Number 1. Wrong turn. This is easily the most frightening thing to ever happen to me in my life. I grew up out in the country. My family lived out on a ridge. We had a large, very large, extended family that was scattered throughout the entire tri-state area. This being the case, I was generally used to the rural settings and was never really afraid of it, even though it tends to get much darker, and I know many people find the darkness of the country to be very scary. I never really did. But of course this story does take place in the dark, and it is pretty scary. I had been over at my aunt's house babysitting my cousins while she was working the second shift at work. She got home pretty late and offered me to remain over and sleep the night there. However, I was really tired. I was never the type of person who was able to get really good sleep at anyone else's house, so I declined the offer. I set out home. I had only recently begun driving at all, much less driving places that I am not familiar with. And although I had driven to my aunt's house in the past, it wasn't as late at night. What I had to do, since my aunt lived in an adjacent state, was get down off the hill that she lived on. I would then take a gravel road out to a paved route, which would take me to town, and then I would head for the bridge that would take me over the river back into my own state. I had been driving for a while that night, thinking that everything had been fine. You know, a lot of times when you get lost, you don't really realize that you're lost at first, but you begin to realize it when you've been driving around for a bit, and you notice it is taking you longer to get to the place you assumed you were going. Well, that is exactly what happened with me on this night. I was trying to get down off the hill, like I mentioned to you, but strangely, at one point, the road turned, and I realized I was going back uphill. And that was the point when I realized that I must have taken a wrong turn. I should not have been going back uphill at any point during that drive. At first, being lost didn't bother me too much. I figured I would just find a place to turn around, and then I would easily be able to make it back to where I'd been trying to go in the first place. However, there were not a lot of driveways to turn around in, and the road I was driving on was way too skinny for me to do a 3-point turnabout on the road. Hell, it was way too skinny even to have a car traveling in the opposite direction. The only driveways that I had passed at that point were also gated off, and there was not much room for me to turn around in them. Still, at that point, I wasn't worried. I mean, like I mentioned, I didn't find the darkness of the country to be scary. I grew up in it. I knew that if I just kept on my way, I would eventually find a way to turn around and get back to the road I needed to. I wasn't worried at all. And then I saw something up ahead of me. I slowed down a bit because it was a person, a man, walking on the road. He was walking on the inner part of the road, on the very narrow strip of land between the hill and the road. He didn't have a flashlight or anything, which meant that he had been walking in the pitch dark before my headlights had fallen on him. I slowed down a little bit, mostly because I didn't want to actually hurt the guy. And then I began wondering if I should ask him if he needed help or anything. For some reason, though, I immediately disliked the idea of asking him if he needed help. He was a man walking alone, a dark country road, on a hill in the middle of the night without a flashlight. That was just strange, and I decided it would just be best if I continued on my way. But when I started to pass him, I saw him looking intently at me through the windshield. When I was going right past him, though, he grabbed the handle of my car door and tried to open the door. Fortunately, the door was locked, so he wasn't able to get it open. He then began pounding on the window of the door really hard, like he was trying to break it. The guy also began yelling at me, but I was too freaked out to really hear anything he had to say. In my panic, I stepped on the gas and tried my best to get away. Since I was going uphill, this was a dangerous thing to do, as the road was also rather curvy, but at that moment that wasn't my major concern. At first the guy tried to keep up with me, but soon I was able to speed up, and he had to stop his pursuit. I got away from him. I was so freaked out about what happened that I had to change my entire strategy to find my way off the hill. I didn't want to turn around at that point, because that would mean I would have to go back down the hill and go past him again, and that was not something I really wanted to do. So I kept driving, hoping that the road didn't dead end. It didn't, but it did lead me to a few roads I was not familiar with. It took me a while to find my way back to a place that I was familiar with, and I ended up getting home. Very late, of course, but at least I was safe. I don't know who that guy was or what he wanted. I'm happy I never found out. Number 2. High Trestle. My younger brother Rick and I, along with a couple of our friends Dale and Joey, decided that because this was the last week of summer vacation, we would get our Stingray bicycles out and ride to High Trestle, a part timber and steel railroad trestle built back in the 1930s. It crossed a precipitous ravine around a massive bluff about 3 miles southwest of town. It was called High Trestle because its highest point was about 100 feet above the ground. The trestle was also known for its length at nearly a quarter of a mile. It curved around the bluff in such a way as to reduce visibility or detection at the last minute, that proved time and time again to take its grisly toll on anything and everything too slow to respond or caught by surprise. Even the single railroad crossing, whose gravel road serviced the farms north and south of the trestle, would report automobile or tractor casualties when the train would barrel unseen and unheard eastbound from around the bluff. If you were on foot, you only had 2 options, and that was to either run or jump. For those unfortunate enough to have to choose, the gruesome result would always be there later for someone to find. Deer, coyotes, foxes, weasels, raccoons, cows, horses, dogs, cats, snakes, snapper turtles, hawks, ducks, geese, and the occasional unwary human ventured out to beyond the point of no return. This would get caught. They would get caught and either mowed down on the tracks, shoved off by the locomotive, or forced to jump into the gaping ravine below. Few survived the train or the plunge, and their remains would eventually be found either on the tracks above, or broken on the ground, or hanging on support ladders that jabbed up like spikes in a bear pit below. Some timbers sported a length of 40 to 50 feet and looked like a creosote-soaked petrified forest from above. They were still used for anchors or support in construction and maintenance of the trestle. Our reason for going out there was always that maybe this time we'd find some hobo or gypsy or bank robber's bloodied and dismembered corpse strung out over a quarter acre. Or maybe even some of the money one of the robbers had gotten away with while hiding out or making their getaway after knocking over the Mitchellville Savings and Loan Bank earlier that year. We never did find any actual human remains, but imagining the possibility almost always proved to be too much to resist. We were never, either together or alone, too shy or afraid, looking for stuff like that. It was just one of the many brainstorm ideas we had, living in a small rural farm town in the early 1960s. Once we reached the trestle, the drill was to hide our bikes in some of the brush along the side, just in case someone from one of the nearby farms decided to teach us another lesson on five-finger discounts. We'd made that mistake earlier when another friend had gotten his bike stolen, and we all had to walk the 3.5 miles home. Likewise, we knew better than to take the bikes across because we'd made that mistake once before too, and had to throw them off into the ravine and run like hell before the train mowed us off the tracks. At that time, a fast-moving freighter nearly caught us when it suddenly and silently rounded the bluff. Despite our age and barely passing marks in arithmetic and math, we somehow knew the amount of track and time it took for a 60-car, fully laden freighter to cross the quarter mile across the trestle and come to a complete stop at 50 miles per hour. The rule was, if you had to cross the trestle, always do it during the day, because then you could see to avoid it. But if it was at night, you could never see the light or hear the horn in time before it was on you. Nobody wanted to end up like some of the victims we'd find, but being a young kid in a small town meant that you were always looking for something, whether forking hay with a pitchfork and a baling machine, cutting trees with a chainsaw, and splitting the lengths into firewood with a two-headed axe, or getting caught in a fire drill at school, where all the kids in the upper floors had to descend a rickety old fire escape that turned out to be more dangerous than any actual or imaginary fire. It was all, more or less, like the proverbial watermelon, never tasting as sweet as when it was stolen from the neighbor's garden. Life in a small rural town, without danger, wasn't really living. An adventure without risk wasn't worth talking about. Once we reached the edge of the ravine, and the beginning of the trestle, I could see the deepening shadow and the thin stream meandering its way down and out to the corn or soy or clover fields further south. I could feel the hot summer wind wafting up from below and the hot summer sun baking my face and hands, and I can still smell the tar and creosote on the ties and the rail bed. Such as it was, looking back, it was a little piece of heaven. We all knew that our only real choice lay in crossing the tracks above, because to descend into the ravine on this side was not only more treacherous, but it would add a lot more time onto an already rapidly dwindling day. And besides, where's the adventure in that? Fingering the chunks of rock flaked with pyrite I'd picked up along the tracks earlier, we made our way down the trestle. I imagined the rocks were magically endowed with some foreknowledge of things to come, and chuckled. That maybe was another reason they called it fool's gold. Me and the eldest, I asked everybody if they wanted to cross the tracks or go home. It would be quicker crossing the tracks, but it would also mean staying along the edge in a sheer drop to avoid the splits between the ties, while at the same time avoiding the bolt heads along the entire length, and not tripping or falling off along the way. We all agreed on the tracks, and stopped for one last moment to check ourselves, say a little prayer, and listen for any sound or vibration that would signal there was a freighter approaching. With all that out of the way, we beat it across, some of us on one rail and some of us on the other. Back then, whenever I would take the tracks home from school, I would always walk or balance on one rail as far as I could before falling off. Sometimes I'd keep from falling by jumping from one rail to the other. At other times I would count the ties in threes, 3, 6, 9, 12, standing on one and jumping to 3, etc., until I lost count. I did the same thing here, sometimes crossing between rails, counting the ties, avoiding the gaps and balancing on each rail, while running as far as I could without falling off. The 15 minutes it took to cross felt like 60, and we counted ourselves lucky, blessed, and not a little crazy. But that was all right, because we would, we thought, live to fight another day. For most of us, to fight who or what didn't extend much beyond the class bully who'd push the younger kids down on the playground, steal a swing belonging to someone else, or jump off the teeter-totter when someone was still on it. Seemed like there was always at least one of those in every school. What were they, specially appointed, elected, or just volunteers? It didn't matter. Because to us, bozos like him could never imagine what we did, let alone cross high Trestle or make the ride it took to get there. All bullying and no play makes Jack a big fat creep. Once we reached the other side, still panting, victorious, we decided to climb down to the creek, wash off the diesel dust and creosote, look for snapper turtles, search for new victims, avoid the poison ivy, and generally just hang out until we decide to begin the journey back up and out for home. Finally, we began the ascent on the same side we descended, because the opposite was mostly vertical, and the soil extremely loose and wet from the rain the night before. Rather than crossing back on the rails again and taking our chances with an oncoming train, we thought it would be safer and more fun to cross on the iron skirting that ran along the underside of the rail bed, just below the tracks. Since we were all still short and not yet our full height, we were able to scooch along the rail, holding the upper fluted skirting with our hands and the lower with our red ball jets. We passed the first girder at approximately 40 feet from the edge and 20 feet from the ground, silently, slowly, and patiently making our way to the next. The next put us about 100 feet from the edge and 40 feet off the ground. When we reached the 180 feet from the edge and 60 feet from the ground section, I was suddenly distracted by the sound of human chatter behind and south of us, downstream from the creek. Nobody else was supposed to be out here. We'd always made a point of not letting anyone else know. Secrecy was an essential element of our adventures. We didn't want anyone else to know apart from those who were invited. They were sworn to secrecy, or they were permanently banned. If our parents found out anything about what we were doing, we'd never be able to do anything. We'd be perpetually grounded, hence the urgency of who was out there and how they found out. Bracing my feet and hands on the edging, I craned my head back behind me to see who it was and what was going on, and discovered that it was Curtis P., my once best friend but now worst enemy, because he tried to get me into a fight with Paul W. over a lie he told Paul about me. I began yelling at Curtis and his fellow thugs to get out of here because he was no longer my friend, and I didn't want anything to do with him. When, trying to see behind me, I shifted my weight onto my left foot while searching along the flute with my right, and my foot caught on the edge of a large bolt, throwing my weight sideways, spinning me around and forcing me to go both hands and jump out onto a 12 by 12 horizontal support beam that was nearly 6 stories above the ground and was holding up the skirt and track on this side of the trestle. Because my weight was now leaning forward, I instinctively hopped down onto a second and longer 12 by 12 support beam, and still off balance, leapt deliberately and reflexively off the trestle. As I was falling, the rocked with a fool's gold in my jacket pockets, and the uprush of air at first suspended everything above me, like a makeshift parachute. I pulled my arms down and out, using the jacket to catch as much wind as possible, thinking that it would slow my descent. Falling, I thought of all the stories of some of the old hobos or gypsies that have fallen off or jumped because they had been taken unawares by one of the night trains, pitching them headlong into the ground or onto the jabbing forest of support poles below. As I started to scream, I thought I must have nearly reached maximum velocity, so I made a point of trying to fall straight down, feet first. I imagined using my billowing jacket to keep me from tumbling and guide me between the creosote poles, some as thick as tree trunks, jutting out of the ground below me. Somehow I managed to accomplish both, but once I hit the ground, the impact sank me up to my pelvis in the soft black topsoil that eroded from the edges of the ravine, and consequently knocked the air completely out of me. Gasping for air, my brother and our friends moved quickly back across the skirting and down the side, screaming and crying because they thought I was dead or dying. Later, my younger brother Rick told me that the only word I uttered was "Mama." Curtis P. and some of his henchmen tried to come over, but my brother called them off for having caused it in the first place, and shortly thereafter they left. The sun started to set, and all I could think about was the savage pain in my back, legs, and arms. All had taken the brunt of the concussion, yet miraculously no bones were broken, just torn muscle and tendons. On the way home, I tried to ride my bike, but the pain was so great, all I could do was lean on my brother or one or the other of our friends, take a few steps and fall, or occasionally lean on the bike, take a few steps and fall again, slowly traversing the 3.5 miles home. It took us nearly 4 hours to get there. When I got back, my mother wasn't there, so my older brother called her after drawing me a hot-as-I-could-take-it bath with Epsom salts. She apparently said she was too busy and hung up. She was probably at a bridge club. My mother and I were never close. When she finally did get home, she said it was my own fault and to live with it. In spite of her, I took her advice and did. Taking me to a doctor somehow never occurred to her, but it occurred to my brother, and he was so mad at her disregard, he called her a selfish bitch to her face. He got slapped pretty hard for that. For weeks I couldn't stand up, except for short jaunts across the room or from chair to bed. I did get a lot of reading in, though. Most kids would have relished an extended vacation, but for me, being at home with her was far worse than anything the bullies of the world could conjure up. It took 2 weeks of sleeplessness, pain, and fear, but I was determined that I would walk again. When I got back to school, my classmates thought I was kind of a hero because I was the only person that they had ever heard of who'd fallen off high trestle and lived. For months, the fall haunted me. Of course, my mother told me to never, ever go out there again, but I knew I had to, or I would be afraid forever, and so she would win. I somehow knew revisiting the trestle was the only way to conquer my fear and end the terror. It had to be done. One day, after delivering the Saturday morning register to the 24 homes on my route, I went back out on my bike by myself. I walked the entire length across and back. No train came. Going back there was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. I remember the autumn wind blowing particularly hard against me all the way back there. It was as though it was trying to knock me off my bike, and then off the trestle when I crossed. It was as though it was furious at me for getting away and then for having the audacity to come back. At one point, I thought I heard my mother's screams as though she thought I were taunting her. Nonetheless, all the way back home, I took the return wind as an affirmation. I practically flew all the way. I think she must have known, when after the beating from my stepfather for being late, she asked if I had gone back out there. Of course I lied and said I hadn't. I learned a long time past that telling my mother the truth about anything, let alone talking to her about my thoughts or dreams, always resulted in verbal or physical abuse. Growing up, I lived with the belief that if I mostly kept my mouth shut and answered yes or no questions, and still did what I had to without her or anybody else knowing, I could avoid a lot of the pain, abuse, and heartache that, whether she or anyone else approved or not, didn't matter. One way or the other, though, whether justified or not, I knew I was always going to pay a price for it. I believe the fall was, up until then, price. At a fairly early age, I knew my mother was mad and my stepfather a drunken brute, and in spite of them, I had to survive to fight another day. Unbeknownst to almost everybody else outside my immediate family, There was more than just the bullies at school to contend with. All those years, despite the constant fear of pain and punishment, whether for real or imagined transgressions, I somehow knew instinctively what had to be done, at least for myself and my little brother. Over the years, I had learned to adapt to the circumstances at home, school, the playground, or on the street. I developed a high tolerance for physical, mental, and emotional pain. I imagined myself stoically invulnerable to almost everything, but the truth is, no one is invulnerable. For all the pain and hurt one suppressed throughout their life, it will come back to you one day to haunt you. Someone once said that everything you've ever heard, felt, tasted, smelled, seen, learned, or experienced is never forgotten. It's all there somewhere, just under the surface, as fresh and clear and sharp as the day it happened. Somebody else once said that at the time of death or near death, all of your life will flash before your eyes. Many of us experienced that while growing up. Some of my schoolmates and friends lived to tell the tale, others didn't. To me, the single most important thing in all of this is to always remember and never forget is what somebody else once said. It is in times like these that you will learn who your real friends are. Number 3, Window Peeker. When I was 18, I was going to beauty college, and I lived in a trailer in a sketchy trailer park. It was cheap and I needed a home. One evening, I glanced out my window, and I noticed a man across the road from my trailer. He was smoking and pacing back and forth beside someone's house that was part of the park. In the dark, not at their door, but at the side of their house. I closed my curtains afraid. I didn't know what he was doing and felt scared of him. He was sure interested in something in that house. He was forgotten until a few evenings later. I looked out and he was there, repeatedly walking, waiting, and chain-smoking. I decided I wanted to see what he was up to, so I kept a keen eye on him. Time passed. A light came on in the room above him. The blind was raised a little bit at the window. The man stood below the window. I surmised it was a bedroom window. He raised himself up and stood on something so he could be tall enough to stare into the window. I didn't have a phone, so I couldn't call anyone. I was afraid to confront the guy on my own. I was an immature young girl. The next day I walked over to the landlord's office and told them what I'd seen. I told them about the guy and his window peeking. They weren't surprised and didn't care. He lived there in the park. He was good friends with them. Oh, he just does that when him and his wife have a fight and she leaves. Wait, so it's okay to rent to someone that peeks into people's windows? And be friends with them too? My jaw dropped. I was stunned. I went to the house where I'd seen this happening, and I knocked on the door. A young woman answered the door. I told her about the pervert looking into her window and what had been happening outside her house. She said nothing. I think she was shocked and afraid too. Or maybe she thought I was making it up. That night I watched. The blind was pulled down at the window. Nothing to see anymore. Good, so no guy skulking around. Okay, it's over, I thought. That's the end of it. Nope, it wasn't. I came home late one evening, and the guy was standing there on my porch. I sat in my car trying to think. I had nowhere to go but there. I think the landlords probably told the guy that I'd seen him and what he'd done. The man jumped off my porch and ran around the back of my trailer. It was overgrown back there with high weeds and shrubbery and a good hiding place. I jumped out of my car and made a dash for my porch. I ran inside terrified. I crawled through my trailer to my bedroom crying, with no one to help me to see if the guy was gone or what he was doing. Since he lived in the trailer park, I felt it was hopeless to tell anyone. I had already found out that no one cared. I even told an aunt of mine about it all. She said he just wanted to look. Was everyone crazy? Had he been looking in my windows also? Yes, I thought. I made the decision to move back to my mom's in another state. The last night I was there, I sat in the dark watching TV. Still leery of the guy, I spotted him walking up the sidewalk from the trailer park. He stopped and was staring up at the lit windows of a 2-story house. Skulking around again. I was so happy to get out of there. No one ever confronted him. No police ever came. To this day, he is probably still peeking into unsuspecting people's windows. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the Cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.